In Willowbrook, a peaceful town with a close-knit community centered around the church, a hidden storm was brewing, threatening to shatter lives and leave the town in disbelief. Eleanor Thompson was a woman admired by many in Willowbrook. At 40 years old, she had an air of elegance and grace that belied the loneliness she felt in her heart. Married to Richard, a successful businessman often away on trips, Eleanor found herself living a life that seemed perfect on the outside, but was hollow within. Richard's absences had grown more frequent over the years, leaving Eleanor isolated in their large, beautifully decorated home. The laughter and warmth that once filled their marriage had slowly faded, replaced by silence and the cold comfort of material wealth. Eleanor's loneliness grew so profound that she began seeking solace in the one place where she felt truly at peace, the church. It was here that she first met Father Michael, a man deeply loved by the community. Father Michael, in his early 50s, had been a pillar of strength for the town for over 2 decades, offering guidance to anyone in need. Despite his outward appearance of confidence and faith, Father Michael was burdened by his own doubts and struggles. Their connection began innocently. Eleanor sought his counsel during one of her many visits to the church, hoping to find relief from the emptiness she felt in her life. Father Michael, seeing her distress, offered his support, listening as she poured out her heart. Their meetings became regular, with Eleanor finding comfort in Father Michael's presence, and Father Michael feeling drawn to her in ways he had never anticipated. What started as a simple act of pastoral care slowly evolved into something more, a connection that neither fully understood, but both found impossible to resist. As weeks turned into months, the bond between Eleanor and Father Michael deepened. Their conversations, once focused on spiritual guidance, began to touch on more personal topics. Father Michael found himself opening up to Eleanor in ways he had never done with anyone before, sharing his doubts about his faith and his role in the church. He spoke of the weight of his responsibilities and the loneliness that came with the collar he wore. In Eleanor, he found a confidant, someone who saw past the priestly robe to the man underneath, who understood the burdens he carried. Eleanor, in turn, found in Father Michael a kindred spirit. His empathy and understanding were a balm to her wounded heart, and she began to look forward to their meetings with a sense of anticipation she hadn't felt in years. What had started as a search for comfort and guidance had blossomed into a deep emotional connection. Their conversations grew more intimate, their touches lingered longer, and soon the line between friendship and something more began to blur. One warm summer evening, after a particularly emotional conversation, Eleanor and Father Michael found themselves alone in the quiet sanctuary of the church. The candles flickered softly, casting shadows on the stone walls. Overwhelmed by emotion, Eleanor reached out, her hand trembling as it touched Father Michael's cheek. He hesitated, torn between his vows and the overwhelming desire he felt, but the pull was too strong. Slowly, he leaned in, and their lips met in a tender kiss filled with years of pent-up longing. For a moment, time seemed to stand still, but as quickly as it began, reality crashed down upon them. Father Michael pulled away, his face pale with guilt. Eleanor, too, felt the weight of what they had just done. They both knew that this kiss was a line that should never have been crossed, but the feelings between them were undeniable. The affair had begun, and with it, the seeds of tragedy were sown. The days that followed were filled with a tense mixture of excitement and dread for both Eleanor and Father Michael. Each time they saw each other, whether during Sunday Mass or in the quiet confines of the church office, their shared secret hung in the air between them, a silent reminder of the line they had crossed. Despite their best efforts to maintain a facade of normalcy, the bond between them only grew stronger. Their stolen glances and fleeting touches became more frequent, their conversations more charged with unspoken desire. Eleanor, who had once felt so lost and alone, now found herself filled with a renewed sense of purpose. The emptiness that had plagued her for years was replaced with a fervent passion. Yet with this passion came a growing fear. She knew that what she was doing was wrong, both morally and ethically, but the emotions she felt for Father Michael were too powerful to deny. She began to rationalize her actions, convincing herself that their love was pure, beyond the constraints of ordinary relationships. For Father Michael, the internal conflict was even more intense. His vows as a priest weighed heavily on him, and he spent countless hours in prayer, begging for the strength to resist the temptation that Eleanor represented. But each time he saw her, his resolve crumbled. The love he felt for her was unlike anything he had ever known, a love that transcended the spiritual, touching him in a way that shook the very foundations of his faith. He was torn between his duty to God and his overwhelming desire for Eleanor, and the struggle was beginning to take its toll. Their secret meetings became more frequent and daring. They would meet late at night in the rectory, under the cover of darkness, where they could be alone and free to express their feelings. These encounters were fraught with tension, as they both knew the risks they were taking. Each time they were together, the fear of being discovered loomed large, but the intensity of their emotions made it impossible for them to stop. They were caught in a whirlwind of passion and guilt, each encounter pulling them deeper into a web of lies and deceit. It was only a matter of time before the fragile balance that Eleanor and Father Michael had maintained began to crumble. One evening, as Eleanor returned home from one of her secret meetings with Father Michael, she found Richard waiting for her in the living room. His face was tense, his eyes filled with suspicion. He had noticed the changes in Eleanor's behavior. The late nights, the furtive glances at her phone, the way she seemed almost happy, a stark contrast to the melancholy that had defined her for so long. Richard's suspicions grew, and he started paying closer attention to her movements, questioning her about her frequent visits to the church and the time she spent away from home. Eleanor, sensing her husband's growing unease, tried to reassure him, but the lies she told only added to the tension. The once comfortable routine of their marriage was now fraught with anxiety, as Eleanor struggled to maintain the facade of a dutiful wife while secretly engaging in a forbidden affair. The pressure of leading a double life was beginning to wear on her, but the thought of ending the relationship with Father Michael was unbearable. She was trapped in a situation of her own making, with no clear way out. Richard arrived at the church with his heart pounding, his mind consumed by a mix of anger and betrayal. The town was quiet, the streets deserted in the late evening, but the rage inside him roared like a storm. He parked his car haphazardly outside the rectory and stormed toward the door. Inside, Father Michael was preparing for the evening prayers, unaware of the impending confrontation. He had spent the day battling his own demons, praying for strength and guidance, but no prayer could have prepared him for what was about to unfold. When Richard burst through the door, Father Michael immediately knew that something was terribly wrong. The look in Richard's eyes was one of pure fury, a look that chilled him to the bone. Before he could even speak, Richard was on him, pushing him back against the wall, his face inches away from Father Michael's. The priest tried to calm him, tried to speak, but Richard's words came out in a torrent of rage and accusation. "How could you? How could you betray me like this? You're supposed to be a man of God, and you did this to my family, to my wife." Father Michael was stunned, barely able to comprehend the words being hurled at him. He tried to protest, to explain, but Richard's grip tightened, cutting off his words. The reality of the situation crashed down on Father Michael, the gravity of his actions hitting him all at once. He had known this day might come, had feared it, but now that it was here, he felt utterly unprepared. Richard's anger was escalating, his voice growing louder, more desperate. He couldn't contain the pain that was tearing him apart from the inside. He wanted answers, explanations, something to make sense of the betrayal he felt, but all he could see was the man who had destroyed his life standing in front of him. The man he had trusted, the man who had been a spiritual guide to him and his wife, had now become his worst enemy. Father Michael, finally finding his voice, pleaded with Richard to calm down, to let them talk, but his words fell on deaf ears. Richard's emotions had taken over, and there was no reasoning with him. The confrontation became physical, Richard shoving Father Michael, his fists clenching and unclenching as he struggled with the overwhelming urge to lash out. But then something snapped inside Richard. The rage that had been driving him suddenly turned into a deep, almost unbearable pain. He stumbled back, his anger giving way to grief. Tears filled his eyes as he realized the full extent of what had happened. The woman he loved, the life he had known, had been shattered beyond repair. He collapsed onto a nearby chair, burying his face in his hands, sobbing uncontrollably. Father Michael stood frozen, his own emotions in turmoil. He had never seen Richard like this, so broken, so vulnerable. The guilt that had been eating away at him now seemed insurmountable. He reached out hesitantly to comfort Richard, but as soon as his hand touched Richard's shoulder, the grief-stricken man recoiled, his eyes filled with a mix of sorrow and disgust. "Don't touch me!" Richard spat out, his voice choked with tears. "You don't get to comfort me. You don't get to pretend that you care. You ruined everything." The words cut deep, and Father Michael withdrew, his heart heavy with regret. The man who had once been his friend, his parishioner, was now looking at him with nothing but hatred and contempt. And the worst part was, Father Michael knew that Richard was right. He had crossed a line that should never have been crossed, and in doing so, he had destroyed not only Richard's life, but his own as well. The confrontation at the rectory left both men emotionally shattered, but the night was far from over. Richard, his mind still reeling from the betrayal, stumbled out of the church, his thoughts a chaotic whirl of anger, pain, and confusion. He didn't know where to go or what to do next. All he knew was that he needed to get away, to escape the suffocating reality of what had just happened. Father Michael, left alone in the rectory, sank to his knees, overwhelmed by a sense of dread. He had tried to justify his actions, to convince himself that his love for Eleanor was something pure, something beyond reproach. But now, in the cold light of Richard's rage, he saw the truth. He had betrayed everything he stood for, his vows, his faith, his community. The weight of his guilt was unbearable, and for the first time in his life, Father Michael felt truly lost. As the night wore on, Richard found himself back at home, pacing the floors of the living room, unable to calm the storm inside him. Eleanor was nowhere to be found, likely hiding away, terrified of what Richard might do. His thoughts kept returning to the church, to the confrontation, to the look on Father Michael's face when he realized that his secret was out. The memory fueled Richard's anger, and as the hours passed, that anger began to morph into something darker, something more dangerous. By the early hours of the morning, Richard had made a decision, one that would change the course of all their lives forever. He grabbed his car keys, his mind made up. There was no going back now. He drove through the dark, empty streets of Willowbrook, the familiar landscape passing by in a blur. When he arrived at his destination, he sat in the car for a long time, staring at the house in front of him, his hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly that his knuckles turned white. Finally, he got out of the car and walked to the front door. His heart was pounding, his mind racing with thoughts of revenge, of justice, of the life that had been stolen from him. He knocked on the door, each knock echoing in the stillness of the night. When the door finally opened and Father Michael stood before him, Richard didn't hesitate. The anger that had been simmering all night boiled over, and with a swift, brutal motion, he pushed past Father Michael and into the house. What happened next was a blur, a violent, chaotic blur of emotions and actions that neither man could fully comprehend. Richard's rage had taken over completely, driving him to do the unthinkable. In the midst of the struggle, in the heat of the moment, Richard's hands found something solid, a heavy object, something that could be used as a weapon. Without thinking, he swung it, the impact echoing in the quiet house. Father Michael crumpled to the ground, blood pooling beneath him, his eyes wide with shock. For a moment, Richard stood frozen, the reality of what he had done slowly sinking in. The house was deathly silent, the only sound the pounding of his heart in his ears. He looked down at Father Michael, at the man he had just killed, and a wave of nausea and horror washed over him. He had come seeking justice, but what he had found was something far darker. He had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed, committed an act that could never be undone. As the first light of dawn began to filter through the windows, Richard knew that his life was over, destroyed not just by the betrayal of his wife and the priest, but by his own actions as well. The murder he had committed in a fit of rage was the final, tragic consequence of a series of choices that had spiraled out of control. There was no going back, no redemption to be found. The unthinkable had happened, and the once peaceful town of Willowbrook would never be the same. The morning sun rose over Willowbrook, casting long shadows over the town that had yet to wake to the horror of the night before. Richard, numb with shock and disbelief, stood alone in the house where he had just committed the unthinkable. Father Michael's lifeless body lay on the floor, the blood slowly seeping into the wooden planks, a silent testament to the violence that had taken place. For a long time, Richard couldn't move, couldn't think. The reality of his actions felt distant, like a nightmare from which he could not wake. Eventually, the cold light of day began to penetrate his fog of shock, and Richard knew he had to do something. He couldn't stay there, couldn't face the consequences of what he had done. Panic set in as he realized the gravity of his situation. He had murdered a man, a priest no less, and there was no hiding from that. With trembling hands, he searched the house for anything that might incriminate him, but the evidence was everywhere. His fingerprints, the blood, the weapon. There was no escaping it. Desperate and terrified, Richard fled the scene, driving aimlessly through the streets of Willowbrook. His mind was a whirl of fear and regret, his thoughts racing from one possibility to another. Should he turn himself in? Should he run? Every option seemed impossible, every decision fraught with peril. He could already see the headlines, the scandal that would erupt when the town discovered that their beloved Father Michael had been murdered by one of their own. There would be no mercy, no understanding, only condemnation and punishment. Meanwhile, the town slowly began to wake up, unaware of the tragedy that had unfolded during the night. It wasn't until hours later, when Father Michael failed to appear for morning mass, that anyone suspected something was wrong. Parishioners gathered outside the church, puzzled by his absence, their concern growing with each passing minute. When one of them decided to check the rectory, they were met with a gruesome sight that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. The police were called immediately, and the quiet town of Willowbrook was soon swarming with officers and detectives, their flashing lights casting eerie patterns on the quaint streets. The news of Father Michael's murder spread like wildfire, sending shockwaves through the community. How could this have happened? Who could have done such a thing? The questions were on everyone's lips, but no one had any answers. Detective Sarah Mitchell, a seasoned investigator with a reputation for solving even the most difficult cases, was assigned to lead the investigation. She arrived at the scene to find chaos, a small town reeling from the loss of a beloved figure and the brutal way in which he had been taken from them. Mitchell was a no-nonsense detective, known for her sharp mind and relentless pursuit of the truth, and she immediately set to work piecing together what had happened. The rectory was a mess, evidence of a violent struggle scattered throughout the house. The murder weapon, a heavy candlestick, was found lying next to Father Michael's body, its surface stained with blood. Mitchell knew from the moment she stepped into the room that this was no ordinary crime. There was something deeply personal about the way Father Michael had been killed, something driven by emotion rather than cold calculation. As Mitchell began her investigation, she quickly discovered that there were no signs of forced entry, suggesting that the killer was someone Father Michael knew. This narrowed down the list of suspects considerably. She began interviewing the parishioners, the townsfolk, anyone who might have had contact with Father Michael in the days leading up to the murder. The more she learned about the priest, the more she realized how deeply he was involved in the lives of his congregation, and how many secrets he might have been keeping. It wasn't long before the rumors started to circulate, whispers of an affair between Father Michael and a married woman, hints of a scandal that had been brewing beneath the surface of the town's tranquil facade. Mitchell knew that if these rumors were true, they could be the key to solving the case. But rumors alone weren't enough. She needed evidence, something concrete that would lead her to the killer. As the day wore on, Mitchell's investigation led her to the doorstep of the Thompson household. She had heard the rumors about Eleanor and Father Michael, but she needed to hear it from the source. When she arrived, she found Eleanor in a state of utter despair. The news of Father Michael's death had shaken her to the core, not just because of the loss, but because she knew deep down that her affair with him had led to this tragedy. Mitchell questioned Eleanor, probing gently at first, but with increasing urgency as she sensed the depth of Eleanor's involvement. Eleanor tried to deny the affair at first, but her resolve quickly crumbled under the weight of her guilt and grief. She confessed everything, the late-night meetings, the forbidden kisses, the love that had grown between them. But when Mitchell pressed her on Richard's whereabouts, Eleanor fell silent, her eyes wide with fear. Mitchell's suspicions were confirmed when she noticed the fresh bruises on Eleanor's wrists, the signs of a recent struggle. It was clear that something had happened between Eleanor and Richard, something that had driven him to confront Father Michael. The pieces were starting to fall into place, but there was still one question that needed answering. Where was Richard Thompson? As the investigation intensified, Detective Mitchell knew she was closing in on the truth. Richard's disappearance had raised red flags, and the evidence was beginning to point towards him as the prime suspect. His car had been spotted leaving the rectory early in the morning, and forensic evidence from the scene was starting to match up with what they knew about him. The case was becoming clearer, but the manhunt for Richard had only just begun. Meanwhile, Richard, now a fugitive, was hiding out in a remote cabin he and Eleanor had once used for family vacations. The cabin was isolated, nestled deep in the woods outside of town, a place where he could be alone with his thoughts. But solitude brought no comfort. The reality of what he had done was beginning to sink in, and with it came an overwhelming sense of dread. He knew it was only a matter of time before the police found him. He could already see the look on Eleanor's face when she learned the truth, could hear the whispers of the townsfolk as they talked about the man who had killed their beloved priest. Days passed, and the weight of his actions grew heavier with each passing hour. Richard barely ate, barely slept. The once proud man who had built a successful life for himself was now reduced to a shadow of his former self, consumed by guilt and fear. He knew he couldn't stay in the cabin forever, but the thought of turning himself in filled him with terror. How could he face Eleanor, the town, the world, after what he had done? Back in Willowbrook, Detective Mitchell was closing in. She had pieced together the events leading up to Father Michael's murder and had tracked Richard's movements after the crime. It was only a matter of time before she found the cabin. When she finally did, it was with a sense of grim determination. She knew what she would find there: an emotionally broken man who had committed an unforgivable act in a moment of blind rage. The standoff at the cabin was tense, but it ended without violence. Richard, his spirit shattered, surrendered without resistance. The reality of what he had done was written all over his face. There was no defiance, no anger left, only a deep, abiding sorrow for the lives he had destroyed, including his own. As he was led away in handcuffs, Richard couldn't bring himself to look at Detective Mitchell. He knew there was no excuse for what he had done, no redemption to be found. His life, once so full of promise, was over. The trial that followed was swift. The evidence against Richard was overwhelming, and his confession sealed his fate. The town of Willowbrook watched in silence as the man they had once respected was sentenced to life in prison. The scandal that had rocked the town slowly began to fade, but the scars it left behind would never fully heal. Eleanor, now a widow in all but name, was left to pick up the pieces of her shattered life. The affair that had once brought her so much happiness had ended in tragedy, leaving her with nothing but memories of a love that was never meant to be. Father Michael's death was a wound that the town would carry with it for years to come, a stark reminder of the consequences of forbidden love and the darkness that can lurk beneath even the most peaceful of facades. The town of Willowbrook, once known for its tranquility, was now synonymous with scandal and tragedy. The news of Father Michael's murder, coupled with the revelation of the affair, spread like wildfire, not just within the town, but far beyond its borders. The townspeople were in shock. How could something so horrific happen in their close-knit community? Whispers of the affair and the violent end it met filled the air, overshadowing everything else. For many, the hardest part was reconciling the image of Father Michael, the compassionate priest who had guided them for years, with the man who had broken his vows and engaged in a forbidden relationship. The church, once a place of refuge and comfort, became a symbol of betrayal. Parishioners who had once sought solace there now found it difficult to enter its doors. Attendance at Mass dwindled, and the once vibrant community gatherings at the church fell silent. Eleanor became a pariah, shunned by neighbors who had once been her friends. Her life, already shattered by the events, became even more isolated as she faced the judgment and scorn of the community. The affair had not only destroyed her marriage, but had also stripped her of her place in the town. She could no longer walk the streets without feeling the weight of their stares, the whispers that followed her wherever she went. Richard's actions, though driven by a moment of blind rage, left a deep scar on the town. While some could sympathize with the pain of betrayal he had felt, there was no excusing the murder he had committed. The manhunt, the trial, and his eventual imprisonment became a dark chapter in Willowbrook's history, one that would not be easily forgotten. Despite the passage of time, the events of that fateful night lingered in the minds of the townspeople. The church, now under the leadership of a new priest, struggled to regain its footing. The shadow of Father Michael's actions loomed large, making it difficult for the community to move forward. But slowly, the town began to heal, the wounds gradually starting to close, though the scars would always remain. In the years that followed, Willowbrook slowly returned to a semblance of normalcy, but the memory of what happened remained a cautionary tale whispered among the townsfolk. The events that had torn apart the lives of Eleanor, Richard, and Father Michael served as a stark reminder of the consequences of secrets, lies, and forbidden love. Eleanor, now living a quiet, reclusive life, often found herself reflecting on the choices she had made. The love that once brought her so much joy had ultimately led to ruin, not just for her, but for everyone involved. She visited Father Michael's grave often, seeking some form of closure, but the guilt and grief she carried were burdens she knew she would bear for the rest of her life. Richard, serving his life sentence, spent his days in contemplation, haunted by the actions that had forever altered his existence. The rage that had once consumed him was gone, replaced by a deep sorrow for the man he had become. In his quiet moments, he thought of Eleanor, of Father Michael, and of the life he had lost. There was no going back, no undoing what had been done. All that remained was the long, slow passage of time and the hope that, one day, he might find a way to forgive himself. The town, though scarred, began to move forward, the events fading into the background as new stories, new lives, took center stage. The church, once the heart of the community, worked to rebuild its trust, offering support and compassion to those who needed it. Willowbrook would never be the same, but in time it found a way to continue, to heal, and to remember. And so the story of the housewife, the priest, and the unthinkable murder became a part of Willowbrook's history, a dark chapter in an otherwise peaceful town. The lessons learned, the pain endured, and the lives lost would not be forgotten, serving as a reminder of the fragile line between love and destruction, and the consequences that can arise when that line is crossed.